Today, I'm so excited to introduce you to my sister. My sister is a historian. She has loved history. Have you loved history for a long time?
No, I haven't.
Okay.
I hated history my whole life.
Okay. So my sister, who's always hated history, is now a historian. So tell us, Shana, when did you start loving history or getting interested in history?
So as children, our mother used to drag us to museums regularly, and we would try to make sure that we'd spend at least as much time in the gift shop as we had in the actual museum.
I remember.
But as my career developed as a teacher, as an educator for adults, for high school students, and I was teaching Torah, I was teaching Jewish philosophy and Jewish ideas, and I realized that it all happened against the backdrop of Jewish history, and I became very interested in that aspect of it. And one year the headmaster of the school asked me to take the girls in my class on their annual trip to the British Museum. And being a bit of a yakka, I didn't want to be completely lost in the museum. I wanted to know what I was doing, where I was going. So I did a trip to the museum before I took the girls, and I familiarized myself with the museum. I bought a bunch of books in the gift shop.
Right.
And I read them.
Oh, wow.
And I came home so excited. British Museum, when it was first set up in its inception, so we're talking about 1700s, 1800s, it was part of the empire, the idea of British Empire. But at the time, the Brits were proudly religious Christians.
Right.
And because of that, when they went on archaeological digs, they had an eye for artifacts of biblical interest. So the things they brought back to the museum often had a lot to do with our story, with the Tanakh. And it was so thrilling to actually see artifacts. It's hard to connect to stories that happened 2,000 years ago, 2,500 years ago.
Yes.
And yet we are very deeply connected to our history as Jewish people. And I went to the museum and I saw these artifacts and they brought these stories to life. And I thought, this is so special. I have to share this. This is something out of the ordinary. And the more I went and the more I discovered and the more I saw, the more I realized what a national treasure it was. Not just national for the British people, national for us, for the Jewish people. It's a gem. It's just a gem.
What's one of your favorite artifacts, Jewish artifacts that are in the British Museum that you love showing people?
I do tours for each of the Chagim, a whole 2-hour tour for each of the Chagim. Okay. So if we think about Purim, I do a tour about ancient Persia. If we talk about Hanukkah, I'm doing a tour about ancient Greece. This is a museum of civilizations, some more famous than others. Some were lost civilizations before the archaeologists sent by the British Museum dug them up.
Right.
And not only did they dig them up, they invested in scholars who would sit for years and decipher what they were looking at and what they were reading. So this ancient writing from 2,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago, writing from the time of Avraham Avinu.
Wow.
They were able to read what it said and to reconstruct a little bit of life at that time.
I remember when I was on the museum tour with you that you showed me the Rosetta Stone and you said this is so famous and I'd never seen it before, and you explained to us what was so famous about it.
It's a stele, meaning a rock with writing on it, that was found in the city of Rosetta, which is North Egypt, in 1799 by some French soldiers who were stationed there, part of Napoleon's army, and it was actually in secondary use, so it had been taken out of the temple it was originally in and built into a wall in a castle. And they realized that this was significant because it had Greek writing on it, it had ancient Egyptian written script, Demotic, and it had Egyptian hieroglyphic writing. And because it had the same inscription in 3 different scripts, not 3 different languages, because the hieroglyphs and the Egyptian written script was the same language. And then it had it in Greek, but the same inscription in 3 different languages. They were able to use it to unlock the mystery of how to read hieroglyphs. Now, hieroglyphs was already at the time of the Romans an ancient script. So we had lost the art of being able to read the hieroglyphs for 2,000 years. No one had been able to read it.
Wow.
And in Egypt, there's so many tombs and temples covered in this script. The word hieroglyph is a Greek word which means sacred writing.
Oh, wow.
And it was considered sort of the writing of the priests, the sacred writing. Wow. And using the Rosetta Stone in 1822 was a French scholar who was able to decipher that writing.
Yeah.
And they were able to suddenly go back to Egypt and read all these tombs and all these inscriptions, all these papyri. Yeah. And so suddenly a whole new department was able to be opened up. The history of Egypt, or Egyptology, what they call Egyptology, which is the study of ancient Egyptian history.
Yeah.
And they were able to suddenly reconstruct not only the history, but also the culture of the ancient Egyptians. And that's where we come in.
Right.
Because that's very interesting to us.
Yes.
Where when it comes to Pesach, I take tours around and we talk about the culture of the ancient Egyptians from the time when we as a nation were there.
Wow.
And how we didn't get sucked into that culture, how we retained our identity.
That's unbelievable.
And yes, and the role of the pharaoh, the paroi, and the belief system of the ancient Egyptians. Chazal, our sages, they have this saying, Eina daimeh shmiya l're'iyah, which means you can't compare seeing something to just hearing about it.
Right.
Or in English we'd say seeing is believing, or something like that, right? Which means that when you see something and feel it and make contact with it, you are impacted in a much deeper place than just hearing about it.
Right.
And what's so exciting about the British Museum is I can take tours there and I can say we're going to travel through time, or we are now standing in ancient Nineveh, in the palace of Sancheriv in ancient Nineveh. That's where we're standing.
Wow.
And we see in front of our eyes material culture from that era, but in full color, HD. What's it called?
Yes,
it's three-dimensional.
Yes.
And people get so excited.
Right.
And there was Socrates. He was the father of Western philosophy. He has this saying. He says, education is kindling a flame. It's not filling a vessel. Now, of course, our formal education is very important because we give our children skills to be able to act in the world.
Right.
But real education is
getting people
excited and curious and interested.
Yes.
And I find that showing them the artifacts, the most satisfying part of my job is when they go, wow, that is so cool. That is so interesting.
Yeah.
And to see it with their own eyes.
Yeah.
I'll give you a little example. Before Purim, we go around to the Persian galleries, and one of the things they have there is this absolutely enormous plaster cast taken from one of the palaces of Ahasuerus from ancient Persia.
Wow.
And in this plaster cast, you have Ahasuerus or his grandson, depending. I try to be very honest about historical debate. The king, the Persian king, the Achaemenid king, is sitting on a throne holding a long golden scepter. Now, the children will know the Purim story. Right. They know the most important moment when he holds up the golden scepter to Queen Esther.
Right.
And they literally, people get so excited to see, this is what it would have looked like. This is what his scepter looked like.
Wow.
This is not from a storybook. This is from his palace. This is the actual scepter that he would have held up to Esther.
Yes.
So things like that, where you can relive it, you can see it.
Right.
I try actually not to come from a place of archaeology proves our story is true.
Okay.
I let that process happen naturally.
Yes.
So the Tanakh is really, it's the spiritual journey of the Jewish people.
Right.
It's a spiritual book.
Yeah.
With spiritual instruction.
Yes.
And it's written by our prophets.
Yeah.
Not in order to tell us about our history, but in order to tell us something, a spiritual message.
Yeah.
However, the history of the Tanakh is the backdrop for where that all happens.
Right, exactly.
So it's very interesting to see, first of all, to fill in sort of the political machinations and the other details of what was going on behind the scenes.
Yeah.
But as well as that, history, unfortunately, has become very politicized, and a lot of the history, especially biblical history, historians are literally frightened to go down the route of saying, yes, I'm a maximalist. I believe that the history of the Tanakh was exactly as it says, because that has political implications for today.
Yeah.
So they try to be minimalists often. Historians in general in this field try to be minimalists, which means they try to rely minimally on the Bible as a source for history.
Oh, okay.
However, because of what we find in the Assyrian galleries in the British Museum, because of what they dug up, there are certain indisputable facts, and this takes us back to sort of 600 years before the Common Era.
Oh, wow.
So we're talking 2,600 years ago, where you have artifacts that talk about Achav from the house of Omri. Well, we know Achav from the house of Omri, and it talks about the size of his army and the number of chariots he had.
Wow.
So suddenly we have sort of, even for minimalists, are happy to say, yes, there was a northern kingdom. It was powerful. It was wealthy, because suddenly they have, like you say, a extra biblical source which confirms that.
Right.
And that's very exciting for biblical archaeologists. Israeli public are very embattled, right?
Okay.
They're standing in a corner.
Yeah.
They have a lot of voices out there trying to say, you don't have a connection to the land of Israel before 1948, which is, of course, ridiculous. Anyone who has any sense of history, and not just from the Tanakh, you read Greek and Roman history about how they destroyed the Temple of Jerusalem, that the Jewish, you go back,
Any serious historian,
any
serious person,
yes,
doesn't
cannot doubt that. However, when you hear so many voices attacking you, you almost need it for yourself, for your own feeling of, yes, I do have a right to be here. I do have a connection to this land.
I know that you're very passionate about this topic. So what does Jewish history mean to you?
So I feel that in the 21st century, we live in a time where it's very easy to have an identity crisis.
Absolutely.
At all levels.
Yeah.
We're very confused about the question of identity, and for ourselves and our children. And Jewish history for me is a real anchor in terms of identity. So both in terms of geographical, the fact that I have a shared history with so many other people around the world helps me feel connected to the Jewish people as a whole. Yeah. And that's across space, but also across time, because we need to feel that we are part of a continuum of Jewish history, of a nation with a tremendous history that goes back 3,500 years, to Avraham Avinu, and we're still part of the same covenant and the same blessing and the same story. We have a shared past and we have a shared future, and we have a shared mission statement. But what really do I share culturally with someone who lived that long ago? Are we still on the same page?
Right.
Have we lost it? Are we still connected to that chain? And one of the things that's so amazing about looking at an artifact, let's say, I'll give you an example. In one of the galleries, they have something called the Lachish Ostrakon. Ostraka are pieces of broken pottery with writing on them, which was the cheapest and easiest form of quickly scribbling down a note. And we have from the city of Lachish, which is southwest of Jerusalem, from the time of Nebuchadnezzar. So we're talking 500 years before the Common Era, approximately, when he comes into the land of Israel and he's conquering city after city, and we know that will end in the destruction of the first Beis Hamikdash. But he conquers the city of Lachish first, and from that time we have these ostrakon with these hastily scribbled messages from the commanders of the battalion in Lachish, sending messages to each other, asking for supplies, asking for reinforcement. And what it says on there, the way that they speak is they speak with the name of Hashem. So they're constantly invoking. So like we would say, Baruch Hashem, thank God, please God, things like that.
Yeah.
That's how they write. They say, please God, everything will be okay, with the help of God, and they bless each other in the name of God, and they use the four-lettered name of Hashem. And all their names are so familiar.
Yes.
Each name ends with a Yod and a Hey, which is all this, very biblical Jewish names. But it makes me feel, wow, we are part of that continuum. We are part of that culture. That's us. That's me.
Yes.
I find that very exciting.
Wow.
Yeah.
That is amazing.
Before we were speaking about Eina Doma Shmiya L'Re'iyah,
yes,
about how you can't compare
hearing
something to seeing it,
yes,
and experiencing it.
Yes.
So one of the things, I was just remembering, one of the things that I tell my groups, I say, do you see this building? We're about to walk into this magnificent building. So the actual building that houses the British Museum is a famous piece of architecture on its own.
Yes.
It was built by Robert Smirke in the 1820s, based on design for a Greek temple, but the columns outside are colossal. They're huge. They're 14 meters high.
Wow. And
I tell my groups, as you walk through these columns, I want you to look up at the height of this column, because the Tanakh tells us that this is the exact height of the first Beit HaMikdash that Shlomo HaMelech built.
Wow.
And to get a feeling of walking up the stairs and how grand that would have been and how tall that would have been to the people living, 1,000 years before the Common Era.
Wow.
To get a sense of that grandeur. Wow. So that's one of the ways that I try to bring in, to tie it into to our story, to make it an experience, experiential history. Judaism is a very hands-on religion. Yes. Like you said, we don't just meditate, we don't just believe, we do actions and we do experiences, because we believe that every experience we have impacts us.
Yes, and enriches us, and it helps us bring out our best self.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm so excited.
It's been such a pleasure.